I'm used to talking about data trust. One of the things that is an obstacle quite frequently is people, they like the sound of data trust, right? It sounds good. Who wouldn't want data plus trust? And so it's contributed to a lot of problems because, of course, the word data trust has been used and abused to mean all sorts of things. And sometimes those things are just wind of it. So I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of what is a data trust. Effectively, it's a legal answer, a legal framework to address data sharing issues that are very pertinent to research ethics, okay? But before I go into the nitty-gritty, I want to highlight the context, the background that makes this solution stand out. So at the root of what I'm going to say is a perceived tension that too many people take literally, and they assume that there's a necessary trade-off between the two sides of a dilemma, if you want. And you must have heard of those two sides before, but I'll just quickly remind you. On one hand, there are those who deplore the fact that there are many goods, from better healthcare to better transport via better use of natural resources, that do remain out of reach because of our inability to better share data, right? So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is, at the same time, there are those who highlight just how vulnerable we all are when we leak data on a daily basis, okay? And on that front, few would dispute the fact that while data rights are super important, especially GDPR rights, on their own, they are not enough to address the power imbalances that are turning the notion of consent, which is so central to the GDPR, into some dangerous make-believe game too often. Why is it dangerous? It's dangerous because, mostly because of the sense of self-vulnerability at stake, and I'll briefly unpack that. So I'm not going to agonize about the form and roots of the problem, first because I think you're familiar with the problem, and second because I'm here to talk about solution. And the solution I'm going to talk about, data trusts, are just one particular kind of tool within a wider range of bottom-up data employment infrastructure. And the solution I'm going to talk about is not theory anymore. It's important, right? I'm proud to say that Data Trust Initiative has launched, as I said, the first 3 worldwide data trusts in January, and you can have more details on the website. Now, for researchers, data trust offer a means of accessing multiple data types. This is really important, right? Because a lot of the examples you've heard about so far, for instance, biobank or the examples mentioned by my predecessor, a lot of those examples are focused on one kind of data. So let's say health data or whatever, transport data sometimes. But of course, the game in town today is to try and have access to different kinds of data in a way that respects the rights of the people whose data it is, while, and hence that means, for instance, respecting privacy concerns, etc., while at the same time meaning that you can achieve goods like better use of natural resources that often presuppose having access to different kinds of data sets. So that's the advantage for researchers. And on the other side, for research participants, data trust basically provide a route to exerting informed, continuous influence over how and for what purposes data about them is used. And this is really important, the continuous element. It means you're not necessarily signing a check and then closing your eyes and not having any agency anymore for how your data is used. When you have an intermediary like a data trustee to act as on your behalf, you can have a continuous monitoring of data sharing agreements, which also gives flexibility to researchers, which is important. Now, before I delve further into the specific research ethics angle, I think it's important to highlight that data trust provides effectively a positive answer to what is fundamentally a political question. And that political question is, can we return the power that stems from aggregated data to individuals and groups? Now, our answer is yes. And the vulnerabilities at stake, or given those vulnerabilities at stake, I think it's really important that the power be returned via a legal mechanism, data trust, which comes with robust institutional safeguards. So the reason why I've spent some time looking at trust rather than contracts, and this is why we've developed this concept of trust law, is because contracts are in themselves rather brittle. They do not come with very strong safeguards built in. That's not the case with trust law. And so I'm not going to go too much into legal details, because right now you must be probably wondering why this political empowerment dimension is important in the context of research ethics, right? And I'm going to explain this, but first I want to draw a parallel with an interesting historical precedent. Now, you may or may not know that in the 19th century in the UK, the right to vote was basically conditional upon land ownership, right? So to widen the right to vote and give a political voice to otherwise disenfranchised people, land societies were created to effectively buy a strip of land, which was then divided up into little parcels. And the idea behind data trust is very similar. Here, what's at stake is not the right to vote, clearly, but the ability to have a say over how one's data is used and for what purposes. And so instead of pooling together money to acquire a piece of land, here what's pulled together are data rights, not necessarily the data itself, this is really important, in order to acquire a voice over how one's data is used. So to recap, and here you'll be glad I'll get into more concrete questions. Data trusts are effectively in a position to address three concrete problems. First, there's the lack of tools for collective action. Second, data consent is rarely more than make-believe. And third, we do all agree, and especially people in this room, that we need to share data more intelligently. So how do we do that concretely? Well, at the heart of a data trust is the data trustee. And the key point about data trustees is that they have a fiduciary obligation of undivided loyalty towards the beneficiaries of the trust. So in this case, it's the data subjects. Now, this is really important, right? A fiduciary obligation sounds lovely, though you may not know exactly how it differs from other obligations. But if it doesn't come with real teeth, it can provide false assurances, and in that way, do more harm than good. So what's critical about data trust is that each trust is overseen by a court, which has significant intervention powers. And that means that data trustees' fiduciary obligations do have teeth, whereas in other regimes, like let's say in Germany, they have fiduciary obligations that are attached to people who managed Sparkassen, so banks that are savings banks, basically. And while those fiduciary obligations are important, if there's nothing to implement them or to give sanctions when they are broken, then they are actually sometimes more harmful than otherwise. Now, you might ask, and I often hear this, it's okay. Trust law sounds rather complicated, especially French people will be very exercised about that. Are these fiduciary obligations really necessary? And to answer that question, it's useful to think of data trustees as the much needed 21st century profession. So just like progress in the medical sciences gave rise to the medical profession, today, I think we badly need data trustees as a new 21st century profession. And just like we wouldn't ask whether doctors' fiduciary obligations are really necessary, to ask whether we really need data trustees as a fiduciary intermediary layer is to miss the point. And the point is that it's a value-based choice. So yes, we can and should build other types of data institutions. And today, I mean, I'm sure you must have heard about, for instance, data co-ops. There's also data commons, etc. They each have a role to play, but it's important to note that any contractual or corporate structures cannot give you the level of safeguards that a trust can offer. So you will have to choose a structure that's appropriate for your aims effectively and for the level of risk you envisage. And that's critical. So to get concrete, if you do choose to build a data trust to address your needs, your data sharing needs, you are faced with several implementation choices. And I'm only going to mention two for now. First, the governance of a data trust can be highly participatory or completely hands-off. Second, and that's the most important, the data does not need to be stored centrally. And that's absolutely essential, right? The fact that the data does not need to be pulled from wherever it's sitting is important because, in part, if you do go for a centralized model, you're going to face all sorts of infrastructure issues, but also costs and risks. Yeah, we all know how expensive and how risky it is to safely store sensitive data centrally. So with this, the decentralized model, a data trust can be created where the data can remain on the servers of Facebook, HSBC as a bank, or I don't know, Tesco where I go shopping. And the data trustee effectively leverages my rights, the data rights, and those of the others in the trust in order, for instance, to obtain better terms and conditions. But also critically, you can also leverage access rights to potentially interrogate data sets and provide insights back to the members of the data trust in a way that does not presuppose centralized storage of data. Okay, so now I'm going to go quickly here. Here, I think I should mention this. This is kind of a dream scenario, right? Imagine being able to go shopping on Amazon, knowing that you've logged in via your data trust, which has set the terms according to which your data can be collected. So goodbye pop-up windows asking you if you consent to this or that data being collected. Clearly, we won't miss them. Now, that scenario, of course, presupposes that you have a pretty large data trust that, let's say you have millions of people in the data trust. Well, if your data trustee goes and talks to an entity like Amazon and says, look, either you talk to us or we exercise en masse the rights of portability of, say, 2 million people, and we provide this data to an emerging competitor, then Amazon might start to listen. At the moment, of course, people just don't have any power compared to an entity like Amazon. Now, I'm going to wrap up with the two most significant challenges as I see them. I mean, there are many, and I'm very keen to have questions. So one set of challenges relates to the fact that it's essential that there be a variety of data trusts, each embodying one way of balancing data risks and aspirations. So, for instance, what happens when there's a conflict of trust? Yeah, so imagine someone who has put the same data rights in several parallel data trusts. So while it's okay to be part of several data trusts vertically, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about that, horizontally, you cannot put the same rights in several trusts at the same time. So that's an area that will require further work. The other set of challenges has to do with uptake, of course. Many people have a low level of data awareness. As a result, the average level of interest in registering with the data trust will be low. So if data trusts are not to end up as a means of increasing the bargaining power of one of the least vulnerable parts of the population, several measures can be considered. There's the possibility of default data trust, which would require specific oversight mechanism. Now, critical also to note is that this model, I think, will not work unless there's a mix of privately funded and publicly funded initiatives. I will not go into this decision tree for now. This decision tree, you can find it on the website, datatrust.uk. It's a pretty useful decision tree in terms of deciding what kind of data sharing institution you should go for. There are other ways of framing the question, but this is often proves valuable. This report, if you are curious about data sharing infrastructure, this report is super valuable. It took 1.5 years to produce because initially people were talking past each other. It's a kind of consensus position that was endorsed by the Royal Society, the Law Society of England and Wales, and it's been co-produced by Ada Lovelace and the AI UK Council. So it's as close to an official document as you'll get when it comes to bottom-up data sharing infrastructure. Today, it's a hopeful space. We have those live pilots. I'm sure there are many things I haven't had time to talk about, so please ask questions.